In our first story today, we're not going to bother burying the lead. Haiti's dying. After years of deterioration across the country and the rise of a federation of criminal gangs so powerful that they now run most of the country, the Caribbean nation of Haiti has been on the brink for some time. Now though, it appears as if the country is on the precipice of complete and total collapse. Thousands of dangerous prisoners have been released onto the streets. The gangs are working to secure and hold the nation's main airport, and acting president Ariel Henry is stranded outside his own country, with no apparent means to get back in if the gangs can take complete control. A bold, multinational and potentially transformative intervention, finally poised to be led by Kenya after months of diplomatic chess matches, now seems as if it won't come in time to save Haiti, where any lingering hope for peace is rapidly being snuffed out. If the remnants of the nation of Haiti were a Jenga tower wobbling back and forth with half its blocks already gone, then it wasn't just the removal of another brick that brought it crashing down. It was a body slam, one that came by way of the events of March 2nd, 2024. On that day, roughly 4,800 inmates at 2 Haitian prisons, including the nearly 4,000 inmate National Penitentiary, had their Saturday night interrupted by a massive prison break. Some elements of local law enforcement appeared to stand down as the prisons were attacked from the outside by gunmen who plainly seemed to be affiliated with Haiti's gang federation. Other law enforcement officers engaged in a brief firefight with the gangs, but it wasn't anywhere near enough. Requests from 2 Haitian police unions desperately calling for police officers to respond to the prison were either not listened to or just weren't enough. Read or one of the posts, quote, "If we let gangs take the penitentiary, we are done. No one will be spared in the capital." Although several inmates were killed in the hours-long firefight, the vast majority were able to escape. Only a handful chose to remain behind bars: the elderly, the disabled, those who feared being caught in the crossfire, and 18 Colombian hitmen accused of participating in the assassination of Haiti's last president. During the attack, several of those men posted a video to social media pleading for their lives. One of them, Francisco Uribe, said, quote, "Please, please help us. They are massacring people inside the cells." The men would later be confirmed to have survived when journalists passed through the nearly entirely empty prison the following day. The prison break wasn't Haiti's only problem on Saturday. Armed gunmen occupied and then vandalized Haiti's top football stadium, holding one of the employees there as a hostage for several hours. A fiber optic cable was slashed, knocking out many internet service providers for people in Port-au-Prince. Gun battles were reported in several neighborhoods across the city, including in one spot just half a kilometer from the US Embassy, and the Haitian police were rendered functionally unable to attain victory. Several prominent gang leaders are believed to have been released during the prison break. But as cataclysmic as Saturday the 2nd must have felt for the people of Port-au-Prince, it was just one more escalation after a series of gravely serious incidents in the last couple of weeks. Just days prior, the gangs had attacked Haiti's central bank, launched skirmishes in and around the international airport, and killed several police officers in coordinated attacks. That violence has been so bad that the leader of Haiti's gang federation, a particularly nasty individual named Jimmy Chirazier, nicknamed Barbecue, had even called for children to be kept home from school to, quote, avoid collateral damages during the wave of violence. 15,000 newly displaced individuals have joined Haiti's many, many temporarily or permanently homeless residents just in the last couple of weeks. Now, if you've been following our Haiti coverage here on The Situation Room or watching coverage of Haiti elsewhere, we'd hazard a guess that you're asking yourself a key question right now. I mean, why now? And the answer's pretty straightforward. Haitian acting president and acting prime minister Ariel Henry is out of town. We've spoken at length about Ariel Henry in the past, but suffice it to say that this is not a guy who's seen as either legitimate or a force for good inside Haiti itself. He's never actually been elected to office. He's kept on delaying elections after having taken power after the aforementioned former president, Jovenel Moise, was assassinated, and he's been considered by many to have been a part of the assassination plot itself. Over the past couple of weeks, Ariel Henry has been abroad, first to attend a regional summit in Guyana, and then to make an appearance in Nairobi in order to sign a deal with Kenyan President William Ruto and clear out the final roadblocks for a long-awaited international intervention that Kenya is supposed to be spearheading. The problem with all that is Haiti's Federation of Gangs has now been presented with both a golden opportunity and a ticking time bomb, and make no mistake, they are keenly aware of both. Cause chaos, take control, and Ariel Henry would be powerless to stop the gangs from taking over his country. Allow Henry to finalize a deal with the Kenyans and come back home, and it won't be long until Haiti's gangs are at war with many more governments than just their own. Federation leader Cherezier has been perfectly transparent about what this critical window of time means to the gangs. According to the man himself, the gangs are directly responsible for the surge in attacks, which they're carrying out with the ultimate objective of capturing Ariel Henry's ministers, neutralizing Haiti's chief of police, and blocking off Henry's routes of entry to the country before he can return. Said Cherezier in one video message posted to social media, quote, "We ask the Haitian National Police and the military to take responsibility and arrest Ariel Henry. Once again, the population is not our enemy. The armed groups are not your enemy. You arrest Ariel Henry for the country's liberation." On Haiti's streets, the relatives and associates of those who had been imprisoned in Haiti's penitentiaries are now left in fear, some for their loved ones inside the prisons and some for themselves. Because of the chaos of the prison break, it's unclear whether many of the prisoners who were once inside are alive or dead. Not all were friends to the Federation of Gangs that runs the country, and with very few, if any, consequences waiting for the gangs if they choose to settle scores with people who'd been inside the prison, there's no telling whether some of those now ex-prisoners needed to fear capture or execution, or whether they might have been rounded up and taken away during the prison break instead. Other Haitians are now facing a very different set of fears, as people who've gone to prison for offences against them are now all but assured to be roaming the streets again with very little in the way of law enforcement or a justice system to keep them safe. In the aftermath of the prison break, Haiti's remaining leaders inside the country attempted to lock the situation down as best they could. A mandatory curfew was put in place for 72 hours, running from 6 at night to the early morning, with a state of emergency declared. Haitian Finance Minister Patrick Boisvert, who's currently running the country while Henry is overseas, issued a call for police to go to recapture Haitian prisoners before the curfew is up. That curfew has been extended at the time of writing and is likely to be extended once again. But with the gangs running amok and the police only active or even safe in specific parts of the capital and the country, the curfew's enforcement was another matter entirely. In the days following the prison break, it's become increasingly obvious that the balance of power has shifted. Anything the gangs had held themselves back from doing previously was now very much on the table. And right on cue came Cheresier's boldest play for domination since this whole conflict began. On Monday, March 4th, Haiti's gangs marched on Port-au-Prince's International Airport, which handles basically all major air traffic for the country. It's this airport that Ariel Henry would have to use to return to his country, something that was lost on nobody when the airport came under full-scale attack. Although details of the assault haven't yet emerged, gunmen made at least one attempt to enter the airport through a hole in the compound wall, although that ingress attempt was dealt with. Journalists from the Associated Press observed an armored truck exchanging fire with gangs on the tarmac, and workers at the airport were forced to run for cover, although luckily there were no operating aircraft or passengers there at the time. At least one Haitian police officer has died of injuries sustained in the battle, and at least some attackers are believed to have been injured or killed as well. In a second attack, shortly after, Haiti's police academy also came under attack, with 800 cadets and their trainers besieged and pinned down until reinforcements were able to arrive. Now, with an evolving situation like this, we've got to be precise. This episode was written Wednesday, the 6th of March, and the situation could very well have devolved even more by the time that you are watching this. But at least insofar as the initial gang assault on the airport goes, that appears to have been repelled successfully. The problem now is that it's very difficult for any plane or pilot to consider landing at the airport. Haiti has been declared a no-fly area for charter pilots, and neither nations nor airlines are likely to send their aircraft anytime soon. The airport itself may be locked down, but both Haiti and the world now know that it's the next target in the crosshairs of a gang federation that's seeming more and more unstoppable by the day. There's nothing to stop the gangs from massing their forces, starting a firefight, or even breaking onto the tarmac if they don't want to allow a certain incoming aircraft to land. That's going to be a problem, because at the time of writing, Ariel Henry still hasn't made it back into the country. In fact, Henry disappeared entirely from view over the weekend. Last seen in Kenya on the night of Friday, March 1st, Henry was thought to have left the African nation after that, although where he went and what he intended to do was less clear. At the time that the airport assault died down, Henry's whereabouts was still unknown. In fact, he only popped up again on the evening of March the 5th, when he re-emerged in the American territory of Puerto Rico, just a few hundred kilometers away from Haiti itself. According to Puerto Rican media, Henry initially intended to go to the Dominican Republic, which shares an island with Haiti, but his plane circled and then diverted to Puerto Rico after the Dominican Republic closed its airspace. Per a source from Henry's own staff speaking to ABC News, it's unclear when Henry could expect to return to his country. For all intents and purposes, he's stranded, and now it appears that world powers, specifically Henry's major backer, the United States, have decided that it's time to think about an immediate change to Haiti's leadership. According to the Miami Herald, Henry spent the weekend in the United States trying to concoct a plan to fly to Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic using a helicopter and across the Haitian border, thus circumventing the international airport. But with the failure of that plan has come pressure. The US hasn't yet issued a direct call for Henry to resign. Said State Department spokesman Matthew Miller, "We are not calling on him or pushing him to resign, but we are urging him to expedite the transition to an empowered and inclusive government." But according to some reports, US officials called Henry while he was in the air before landing in Puerto Rico to persuade him to step down. Despite the apparent lack of an imminent Kenyan response to the crisis, the White House has also flatly denied any claims that America might consider sending its own troops, particularly its special forces, into Haiti. Those in the know aren't in lockstep around that decision. For example, American diplomat Dan Foote, who was a special envoy to Haiti in the wake of the Moise assassination, told the AP about a US intervention, quote, "It's an absolute necessity now. We've let this slide from worse to worst, all the while abdicating our responsibility to others." But despite that assessment, and others like it, the US seems resolute, at least for now, not to intervene in Haiti directly. As the days wear on inside Haiti, the country's remaining ministers and senior law enforcement officials are scrambling to adjust to the weight of the new targets on their backs. Over 80% of Port-au-Prince is now believed to be outside the government's control, and even the areas where the government still does have dominion, they're less and less secure. The gangs have made a point of using greater firepower, attacking more planes in more coordinated ways, and even publishing videos in which police officers are killed or tortured with one clear underlining meaning: you're next. All the while, the barricades they've set up to keep government forces off their territory have only continued to grow stronger and more widespread. Haitian civilians in many parts of the city continue to avoid work or school as resources start to run lower and lower. The situation in those places is hard to assess, and casualty estimates are almost certainly an undercount, said one Haitian human rights activist to The Guardian, reporting on the situation where she is in Port-au-Prince, quote, "Everyone is hiding behind their doors at home. We can't go anywhere. My colleague had to turn back on Sunday when he went out on the streets because there were too many corpses on his route." And despite the carnage in the streets, despite the women and children now streaming into Haitian hospitals with bullet wounds, the gangs aren't just in control over the population, they're increasingly becoming the new normal. Jimmy Cherizier and his gangs might be bullies, they might even be butchers, but they're also not Ariel Henry. And in a situation like this, that sort of distinction means a lot. Said Cherizier in an impromptu press conference given in a Port-au-Prince slum, quote, "Our goal is to break the system. We are fighting against Ariel with the last drop of our blood." That sort of sentiment isn't new for the gang lord. Accurately or not, he's chosen to portray himself to Haiti as a sort of Robin Hood-esque figure, railing against a corrupt leader and political system. There are only limited options to succeed Henry if he were to step down, and while it's unlikely that Cherizier could cruise to a win a free and fair election, well, there are other ways for a man who controls most of Port-au-Prince to also gain control of the presidential palace. Said Cherizier to Reuters on Tuesday the 5th, quote, "If Ariel Henry doesn't step down, if the international community continues to support Ariel Henry, they will lead us directly into a civil war that will end in genocide." Even if Henry does return to Haiti, it's increasingly clear that the people don't want him there. Henry has long been seen as illegitimate, or at best clinging on to the last threads of legitimacy for dear life. America's calls for him to step aside, the calls from the international community, and even the calls from Cherizier are loud enough, but most of Henry's own nation doesn't have any interest in seeing him retain power. He's ineffective. He's often absent. He's believed to have taken part in the plot to kill his predecessor, and he's been unable to deliver relief even from Kenya via an intervention that's been held up because of problems that Henry himself had the means to solve. Haiti's economic collapse, the unaffordable price of food in this country, and the rise of figures like Cherizier are all catastrophes for which Henry is assigned the blame. But he seems starkly opposed to actually taking any of that blame himself. At this point, Henry has lost the credibility he would need to elect a successor. Said UN spokesman Stéphane Dujarric, quote, "Any elections administered by Henry won't be accepted by the Haitian people. If not for our backing, Haitians would have thrown Henry out long ago." Luckily for Haiti's future, though, there are at least some options for a political transition that involve neither Henry nor Cherizier. According to Henry's own predecessor in the post of Prime Minister, Claude Joseph, Haiti's political opposition is working on a plan to install a 3-member transitional council if Henry resigns or is deposed. Those council members would then choose a new interim president. Meanwhile, the UN Security Council intends to meet on the subject of Haiti, at least at the time of writing, while its fellow Caribbean nations are growing louder and louder in their own calls for Henry's resignation or removal. However, it seems less and less likely that the planned Kenyan intervention could arrive in time, even if every legal and diplomatic barrier went away tomorrow. While the US has stated that Kenyan police officers are waiting on standby even now, flying them into a secure airport and setting up a proper logistical support network are another matter entirely. The clock is ticking down far too fast for that, and the gangs are working to make it abundantly clear that they will stand up to official policy and military personnel in force, whether they've come from inside Haiti or flown halfway around the world. And now from one country's gangs to another, we turn our attention to Ecuador. It was perhaps the grimmest start to the year in the whole of Latin America. In the early days of 2024, Ecuador became ground zero for an explosion of violence. In multiple cities, gangs opened fire on civilians or detonated bombs. Inmates in prisons rose up, lynching guards. As police officers were kidnapped and hospitals stormed, it became clear the government had lost control of the streets. On January the 9th, newly elected President Daniel Noboa declared the country in a state of internal armed conflict. The army was deployed and a 60-day curfew instigated, with 22 criminal gangs reclassified as terrorist organizations. It was an extreme situation, an attempt to punch back at the narco gangs and criminals that for a few terrifying days nearly brought Ecuador to its knees. The good news is that it seemed to work. By most accounts, violence in Ecuador has subsided with the military on the streets. The New York Times reports cheering crowds celebrating the arrival of soldiers in Guayaquil. Axios claims that in the first 3 weeks of the state of emergency alone, murders dropped from 27 a day to 11. Now, to be clear, that is still a lot of murders for a country of 18 million people, but it is an improvement on what came before. Insight Crime calculates Ecuador's 2023 murder rate at 44.5 per 100,000, the highest in Central or South America. Higher even than Haiti, where gang violence, as we just heard, has brought the nation to the brink of collapse. But while this drop in violence is good news for Ecuadorians, it's also been accompanied by some less good news. News that suggests the nation's nightmare may not be over yet. As foreign policy put it, in the weeks since the armed forces first took to the streets, violence in Ecuador has decreased, yet the cost of the nationwide deployment have taken a hit to the already fragile Ecuadorian economy. Or to quote security analyst Daniel Ponton in a conversation with The Telegraph, taking back control of the penitentiaries is one thing, but a military occupation is not sustainable. The problem is that Ecuador's finances have been in dire shape for a long time. According to the Financial Times, 2023 ended with Quito suffering a fiscal deficit of $5.7 billion, equivalent to 4.8% of the country's GDP, a problem compounded by government revenues dropping 10% over the same period. As a result, even before the internal armed conflict broke out, Quito was struggling to pay the bills. Local government salaries, contractor invoices, and social security payments were all delayed. And it's not like Ecuador can go looking for loans to bridge the gap. As a nation infamous for its debt defaults, Ecuador's access to capital markets is pretty limited. Already, the government owes $47.4 billion. And this is where things get tricky for the anti-gang crackdown. According to the Ministry of Economy and Finance, funding the internal armed conflict will cost an additional $1.02 billion each year until it concludes. That is a lot of money for a nation that's already in bad financial shape. And while there's no suggestion soldiers will not receive necessary kit, such tight budgets can impact the war with the gangs in other ways. One of the grimmest revolves around the fate of prosecutors. Unlike the crackdown in El Salvador, Ecuador is still trying to arrange fair trials for arrested gang members. Cesar Suarez, for example, was leading the case against the suspects who stormed a TV studio live on air. We used the past tense because on January the 17th, Cesar Suarez was gunned down in broad daylight. It later emerged that he lacked round-the-clock police protection. In this, he was not alone. Police protection is one of the things Quito currently can't afford. The Economist reports that prosecutors are sometimes forced to pay security escorts, food, and travel costs out of their own pockets. As such, it may be surprising to hear that Suarez was only the latest in a long line of 8 prosecutors to have been murdered since 2022. On the other side of the equation, a lack of money means an inability to fund the social programs that might give teenagers in deprived neighborhoods other options beyond joining the gangs. As foreign policy puts it, poverty and violence leave these Ecuadorian youth with limited alternative opportunities, creating the ideal environment for gangs to recruit and flourish. Of course, crushing the gangs completely would bring its own economic benefits. The Institute for Economics and Peace think tank estimated that rising violence cost Ecuador the equivalent of 6% of its GDP in 2022. But those benefits will only emerge in the long term. Right now, experts doubt whether Quito has the money to continue the crackdown until that point, at least without sparking an economic crisis. The problem is one that the government's very aware of and is actively trying to solve. President Noboa recently went so far as to declare on the radio that, quote, "War is costly, we need to take tough economic measures, and we need to all be on board." Among his suggestions have been raising the level of VAT from 12% to 15%, implementing $1 billion in spending cuts, and reversing a campaign promise to shut down an oil field in the Yasuni Ecological Reserve, something Ecuadorians voted for in a referendum last year. According to the central bank, these measures are vital to stop the economy from contracting in 2024, but they're also likely to be unpopular with voters. And it's here that we get to another major difference between the gang crackdowns in Ecuador and El Salvador. While Nayib Bukele just won re-election in the latter nation, President Noboa is serving out the term of a predecessor who stepped down and will have to face the country in 2025. And while Bukele's party has a majority in El Salvador's legislative assembly, Noboa is having to work with fractious opposition parties that don't want to pass unpopular laws as an election year approaches. The VAT rise, for example, was delayed by lawmakers both to the left and to the right of the centrist Noboa. It was only recently passed on the condition that windfall taxes simultaneously be slapped on banks and a new tax be brought in on currency outflows. Although the bill did at least become law, the wrangling over it, even amid a freshly declared state of emergency, shows how much tougher raising funds internally could be from now on. All of which may be why Quito is also looking abroad for some much-needed cash. The most obvious source is the economic superpower some 3,000 kilometers to the north. The United States, along with the EU and Colombia, has already promised funds to help Ecuador fight its internal armed conflict. A 5-year aid package agreed with Washington at the end of January should bring in a needed cash injection of $93 million. Now, unfortunately, that's probably not enough. Although some compared the package to the Plan Colombia program that funded Bogotá's fight against cartels, paramilitaries, and leftist guerrillas between 2000 and 2015, Inside Crime has pointed out that the Ecuadorian package is tiny by comparison. According to the think tank, Plan Colombia sent Bogotá close to $650 million a year across a decade and a half, 70% of which went on military equipment, intelligence work, and training. Ecuador, by contrast, will get less than $100 million spread out over 5 years, with much of that earmarked for things like capacity building and humanitarian aid. To be fair, it's not even clear a Plan Ecuador would be that helpful. After all, Colombia still remains the world's top cocaine producer. Although the paramilitaries and guerrillas disarmed, its narco gangs remain intact, and while much lower than that of Ecuador, its murder rate is still on par with Mexico and Venezuela. But the bigger reason why no Plan Colombia is likely to be signed off for Quito is likely to do with Ecuador's institutions. As Inside Crime writes, quote, "Ecuador's institutions are severely debilitated and corrupt, making intelligence sharing a double-edged sword." Hence why the White House and Congress have been looking for alternative ways to keep Ecuador's military afloat. One unconventional method was a recent deal that would have seen Quito donate its old Soviet-bought weapon systems to America, which would then ship them on to Ukraine. In return, Uncle Sam would have reimbursed Ecuador with newer military equipment. The plan seemed like a win-win. Ecuador, right now, has too much military kit designed for interstate conflict and not enough designed for urban counterinsurgency operations. By going ahead with the deal, both Kiev and Quito would have gotten more of what they needed, while the White House would have been able to pursue its foreign policy objectives despite House Republicans' current block on Ukraine aid. Sadly, the deal fell apart when Russia retaliated by banning Ecuadorian banana imports. As World Politics Review explains, Russia buys $800 million of bananas per year from Ecuador, representing 20 to 25% of the country's banana exports at about 0.7% of its GDP. As such, perhaps it was no surprise that Noboa called off the plan. A better, if longer-term route to get Ecuador the help it needs might lie through Congress, specifically through the Innovation and Development in Ecuador Act, better known as IDEA. Currently, Ecuador faces steep tariffs on most products it exports to the US. IDEA would eliminate 99% of those tariffs, most likely resulting in an economic boon for Quito. Foreign policy claims this would both put the country on sounder financial footing for its war on gangs, while also boosting job opportunities in deprived areas, thus hopefully giving vulnerable youngsters legitimate alternatives to joining the gangs. It's a nice idea, and probably something that would massively help decrease violence in Ecuador in the long run, but it doesn't solve the immediate problem of money worries in 2024. And make no mistake, solving Quito's cash flow problem is something everyone should care about. Since Noboa announced the internal armed conflict, Ecuador's gangs have gone unusually quiet. As we mentioned at the beginning of this section, crime rates have fallen noticeably. But that doesn't mean the gangs have vanished. With tens of thousands of active members, despite the recent wave of arrests and funding and weaponry from Mexico's cartels, the gangs could put up a bigger fight than they have. Instead, they seem to have adopted a lie low and see approach, reducing their violence even as they continue shipping cocaine on a vast scale. To quote the Telegraph, while Noboa wages war against the gangs in their neighborhoods, cocaine continues to be shipped through Ecuador. Since the beginning of the latest state of emergency, 43 tons of the drug have been seized. Cocaine laboratories remain active, according to sources inside Ecuador's intelligence services. End quote. If that's the case, then the gangs may simply re-emerge when the crackdown is over, when the expense of a nationwide military deployment finally gets to be too much for the government. Again, this is not something you should expect to see in the near future. Ecuador is not on the verge of bankruptcy or failing to pay its soldiers' salaries or anything drastic like that. But in the medium term, the cost of all this deployment will mount. And there may come a time when it is simply no longer feasible to keep up the pressure on the gangs to this degree. If this comes to pass, if no Ecuadorian or international solution is found, then the effects are likely to be felt even in the United States. Last year, as Ecuador's murder rate soared, so too did migration levels. US Border Patrol reported an over 300% increase in encounters with unauthorized Ecuadorians in 2023. Further south, Panamanian authorities reported that Ecuadorians were only second to Venezuelans in trying to cross the Darien Gap. Should the gangs re-emerge, then we're likely to see a return to these migration patterns. For now, though, let's hope that Quito and its allies can find solutions to Ecuador's medium and long-term funding problems, solutions that don't just keep the gangs in their current box, but eliminate the harsh conditions that led to their rise in the first place. And finally, today we're going to turn our attention to Europe and Germany's biggest intelligence breach in decades. Now look, as propaganda coups go, it was near impossible to beat. On Friday, March the 1st, chief editor of the Russian state-owned channel RT, Margarita Simonyan, published a 38-minute clip on social media. Its contents were the exact sort of explosive revelation that journalists reserve the cliché bombshell for. A discussion between top German Air Force officials, including Luftwaffe Chief Ingo Gerhards, so the clip clearly came from a high-level meeting. But it was what the officials were talking about, as opposed to the clip's mere existence, that made it so jaw-dropping. Over nearly 40 minutes, the officers present discussed French and British military secrets. They strongly implied the US had instructors on the ground in Ukraine, and they revealed surprising deficiencies in Germany's own air force. However, the part that really made headlines was the discussion of Taurus. Specifically, the part where they discussed Ukraine potentially using it to destroy the Kerch Bridge linking Crimea to mainland Russia. A high-tech German cruise missile, Taurus has been on Ukraine's wish list since at least spring of 2023, when Kiev asked Berlin to donate the weapon. And it's easy to see why. With a range of 500 kilometers and advanced stealth technology, Taurus would be a nightmare for Russia. It would be capable of hitting targets across the whole of Crimea, as well as air bases within Russia itself. The missile's warhead is also notoriously powerful. It's able to penetrate through deep layers of reinforced concrete in order to destroy a target. Given that the limited number of Scalp and Storm Shadow missiles provided by France and Britain have already caused massive headaches for Russia, adding Taurus to Ukraine's portfolio would be a massive boost. In the leaked conference call, the officers estimated that between 10 and 20 of them would be sufficient to take out the Kerch Bridge. Yet German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been wary of donating Kiev such a potent missile, wary of the escalation that might ensue should Ukraine use Taurus to hit Moscow, wary too of the potential need for German support crews to help with targeting. In October last year, the Chancellor turned down Kiev's request. Just recently, he reiterated his fears that the presence of German support might make Berlin party to the conflict. But while the Chancellor has the final say in these matters, that doesn't mean his government is behind him. The two minority parties in Scholz's coalition, the FDP and the Greens, have been vocal about the need to provide Ukraine with more weapons. Just in February, Scholz was embarrassed when lawmakers from both parties joined with those from his own SPD to pass a resolution calling for long-range weapon systems to be sent to Kiev, a clear reference to Taurus. This seems to be why the Air Force officials were having the intercepted call in the first place, to talk through the practical issues so Defense Minister Boris Pistorius could try to convince Scholz to sign off on the missile's delivery to Kiev. Instead, the loose talk may have wound up destroying any chance of ever getting the Chancellor on board. Taking place over the communications platform WebEx, the call was supposed to be encrypted. But not with fancy German military tech. WebEx is a run-of-the-mill video conferencing software, the sort of stuff that you or I might be happy to use for a meeting, but which was never designed to carry classified military secrets. According to Politico, it also only works if everyone is using the app. Dial in over an unsecured landline, and encryption is not guaranteed. Well, dialing in over an unsecure landline is exactly what Brigadier General Frank Graf managed to do when he joined the conversation from his hotel room in Singapore. Although initial reports that a Russian intelligence agent was on the call now seem to be false, Russian signals monitoring was able to still capture the conversation that followed. And what a conversation it was. Air Force head Inga Gerhardt was recorded describing how Britain transports its own donated missiles into Ukraine before adding, "They have several people on the ground." Now that's a pretty serious breach of London's trust, one that could put British lives at risk. Coming hot on the heels of a separate gaffe where Scholz claimed British and French troops were in Ukraine in support roles, it caused consternation among Berlin's allies. But that wasn't all that was said. The officers also discussed the ways Britain handles the satellite data for French-donated Scalp missiles. According to Al Jazeera, there were likewise oblique references to many people in civilian clothes that speak with an American accent being on the ground in Ukraine. Perhaps most damningly, one officer said he could send further information via WhatsApp in what could amount to an additional security breach. Still, it wasn't all leaking secrets and exposing allies. As German defense analyst Ulrich Fracher pointed out on X, re-listening to the leaked Bundeswehr conversation, and I stand by my first assessment that the most interesting sentence is, "The Ukrainians are currently waging a war that is more high-tech than our good old Air Force." Whatever particular part of the conversation floated your boat, though, the one thing that everyone could agree on was that the leak was extremely embarrassing. The Telegraph called it one of Germany's worst security breaches since the Cold War. Bild Zeitung declared Germany was caught with its pants down again. In Russia, the reaction hovered somewhere between glee and hysteria. While Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov intoned it showed Berlin was planning strikes on Russia, former President Dmitry Medvedev was content with simply declaring death to the German Nazi occupiers. For his part, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius called it a hybrid disinformation attack, although even he had to admit that the recording was genuine. Yet while embarrassing Berlin was certainly a bonus for Russia, it's doubtful the Kremlin's entire plan was step 1, make Scholz look dumb, step 2, big question mark, and then step 3, profit. Rather, the point of the leak may have been less to secure a propaganda win and more to influence Germany's defense policy. Although it's still often painted as the laggard of Europe, the truth is that Germany is in the midst of a revolution in how it thinks about hard power. This can be seen clearest in aid to Ukraine. In the days before war broke out, Berlin was mocked for offering Kiev helmets and field hospitals instead of the anti-tank missiles and grenades countries like Britain were sending. Once the full-scale invasion began, German aid trailed that of peer nations. Today, though, that narrative has been flipped on its head. Today, Germany is the second largest supplier of military aid to Ukraine after the United States, ahead of Britain, ahead of Poland, and way ahead of France. This year alone, Berlin will deliver 7.5 billion euros worth of military equipment to Kiev. Overall, Germany's commitments over the coming years total nearly 18 billion euros. With such a major shift underway, there was no guarantee that Scholz would continue to dither on sending Taurus. After all, the Chancellor had resisted signing off on Leopard 2 tank deliveries for months, only to eventually fold. By leaking the Air Force call, the Kremlin has been able to change the dynamic around the conversation, to link Taurus in the public's mind with escalation, and thus put Scholz in a bind. As Christian Molling, the German Council on Foreign Relations, told the Financial Times, Russia has succeeded in creating the perfect political dilemma in Germany. It will now be all the more difficult for Scholz to reevaluate the situation and change his mind on the Tauruses after all. That's a massive win for Moscow, because while Germany's limited supply of 100 or so Taurus missiles means they could never change the outcome of the war, they could make waging war far more difficult and far more costly for the Russians. By tying Scholz's hands with this leaked audio, the Kremlin just relieved some potential pressure in 2024. Some German politicians recognize this. Defense spokesman for the opposition Christian Democrats Johann Wadefuhl recently bemoaned how the Chancellor's reaction to the leak has been to dig in even harder. To quote him, Scholz has hunkered down in his refusal to send the missiles. He doesn't seem to understand that by doing that, he's become the best piece on Putin's chessboard. Ominously, there are signs that this may not be the last time a revelation like this will hit Berlin. Speaking to Bild, former German head of intelligence August Hanning warned that there may be more recordings to come, saying this leak could have been just the tip of the iceberg. If that's true, then Europe's largest economy may be in for a rough year, a year in which its secrets are spread all over social media by a gleeful Moscow in an attempt to influence its Ukraine policy. Of course, the flip side to this is that the leaks could backfire, that a humiliated Scholz might sign off on sending Taurus in a fit of pique. It's worth noting that the official British and French responses to the leak were mostly attempts to persuade the Chancellor to do exactly that. For now, though, such an outcome remains nothing more than speculation, a hope, perhaps, that something good can come of Germany's recent embarrassment. Whether Chancellor Scholz feels he can take such a decision now in the charged political environment surrounding the leak is something that we'll simply have to wait to see.